Well, hello everyone. It's good to be back. You know, this time last month, I was lying on a beach while my amazing team member, Andrea, took over market update duties. Andrea, of course, did a phenomenal job. We all knew she would. But yeah, I gotta tell you, I'm happy to be back. I don't miss the beach or the sun or the ocean at all. I love this frosty bullshit. Anyway, so yeah, you're back to being stuck with me until I decide to slack off and let Andrea take over again. And with that, we've got a good little update for you this month. Now, November typically marks the start of the slow season, right? AKA winter, AKA frosty bullshit season for Ottawa real estate. And we'll tell you exactly how that impacted our condo and freehold sales for the month. And then in the second half of the video, we're going to give you the latest news on two of the stories we covered in previous updates. Hey, those would be the IPRO and RECO scandal, which we first covered in September, and then Bill 60, which Andrea told you about last month, AKA November. All right, so that's the summary. Now, without further ado, let's get to the details. As always, we are going to kick things off by telling you all about how freehold sales fared last month. Now, I had the freehold stats here, so there they are. Ha! Right where I left them. All right, now before we get into the stats, a quick reminder here that freehold properties are, Ollie, what are freehold properties? We're just gonna let it run. This is gonna be
It's a stat that's measured in months.
No, that's inventory. I knew I was gonna trip him up with that. Freehold property is essentially any property that does not have condo fees. Ollie, you live in one. You should know this.
All right.
Did your realtor not teach you anything? All right, it was probably Pierre. So anyways, yeah, I love you, Pierre, if you're watching this. So freehold property is essentially a property that has no condo fees. You own the house and the land that the house is on. And last month, which would be November, we sold a total of 576 of those freehold properties in this beautiful city of Ottawa. All right. Now, I told you that November marks the start of our slow season. And so it should come as no surprise to learn that we sold way fewer homes in November than we did in October, the month that comes before November, all right? In fact, November's 576 sales total was about 41% lower than October's total of 814. Now, that's what we in the industry like to refer to as a big old drop. But in a big picture sense, 576 sales it's like a fine total for November. Hot year, we might sell something like 700 or 800 freehold homes in November. In a down year, we might see sales dip into the 400 to 500 range. And then in all of those in-between years, like 2025, a total in the mid 500s to mid 600s is about what you'd expect. Moving on, the average sale price for a freehold home in November in Ottawa was just under $773,000. Right now, that's down slightly from October's average of $804,000, which again is to be expected. But $773,000 is well above last year's November average of $756K, and it also happens to be the highest November average we've ever seen in Ottawa. And that's kind of a microcosm of how 2025 has gone for freehold properties. Sales volume has been pretty meek throughout most of the year, but prices have remained very, very strong. In fact, in almost every single month this year, our average sale price has either been the highest ever for that month or the second highest ever, and usually just by a hair, right? So Ottawa's freehold market has always epitomized the old adage that it's better to buy real estate and wait than it is to wait to buy real estate, right? And that's continued to be the trend here in 2025. Now, let's talk about inventory, which is, Ollie.
It's a stat measured in months that has a direct relationship with supply and demand.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Ollie is, he's getting there. He's had all the right words for a while. He just hasn't really been able to put them into a sentence. It was a phrase. All right, so yeah, inventory, which is a measure that we use to express the relationship between supply and demand, went from 3.38 months in October to 3.93 months in November for freehold property. And what that means in practical terms is that based on the recent pace of sales, it would take about 3.93 months to sell all of our current active listings, right? Also, when inventory ticks up like it did in November, it means that for the month, supply outpaced demand. Now, in spite of everything I just said, 3.93 months of inventory is still on the low end of the range we'd expect to see in a balanced market. Right? Anything below 3.5 months actually points to a potential seller's market. In addition to inventory, when we're trying to figure out what's happening in the market as a whole, we also look to sales to new listings ratio and the average time to sell. And in November, our sales to new listings ratio came in at a pretty high 65%, which actually falls into seller's market territory, right? And then our average time to sell came in at 38 days, which, much like inventory, is in the lower portion of the range we'd expect in a balanced market, okay? So, as is often the case, the indicator stats don't all paint the exact same picture, which is why it's important to look at all of them and also remember that they're just rules of thumb. Right? And also at this time of year, they can get kind of wonky. Right? This is a time of year where sales almost always slow down. We'll see very few new listings. And then it's also a time of year where a lot of these unsold listings start coming off the market, right? And those factors can obviously cause our indicator or ratio stats to skew. As always, if you want to get a true sense of what's happening in the market or in some section of the market, talk to a professional, right? Oh, look, there's one. And as a professional who sometimes dabbles in amateurism, I would tell you that our freehold market on the whole right now is pretty balanced. Now, it's funny, little story for you. I was listening to this real estate podcast the other day where the hosts were talking about how there's really no such thing as a balanced market, right? Because in their multiple decades of combined experience, none of these hosts, who are all in different markets, had ever seen a market where everyone was happy, right? Buyers and sellers. And after 10 plus years of doing this myself, I would say that I've also never seen a market where everyone is happy. But do you know what I have seen? I've seen markets where no one is happy, right? And that's been a prevailing sentiment throughout a large portion of 2025. We have a lot of sellers out there right now who aren't happy with where they need to be priced in order to sell. They feel like buyers are being too picky, the process is taking too long, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other side of the coin, you have a ton of buyers who are also frustrated because they feel like everything is still too expensive, prices aren't coming down, they're not finding the sort of quality they expect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm thinking that the true sign of a balanced market isn't collective happiness, but rather it's shared frustration, right? And there's certainly been a lot of that to go around when it comes to the freehold property market here in 2025. Now, condos, on the other hand, are a different story. And with that, let's talk about last month's condo sales, shall we? There are the stats. Now here comes a breakdown. So in November, we sold a total of 198 condos in Ottawa. That was, predictably, well below our October total of 244 sales. And it was also well below our November 2024 total of 221 sales. Now, in a typical November, we'd expect to see a total somewhere between the low 200s and the low 300s when it comes to condo sales, right? So this year's total is obviously pretty low in a big picture sense, but that really shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to Ottawa's condo market. Most condo stats here have been trending down for many months now, except their average sale price, which has essentially stayed flat for a long time. All right, in fact, for well over 3 years now, Ottawa's average monthly sale price for condos has lived almost exclusively within the range bound by $410K on the low end and about $455K on the high end, right? And in November 2025, we saw an average condo sale price here of about $438K, so no exception to the rule. Right? Inventory is where things got real interesting in the condo market last month. In November, we saw Ottawa's condo inventory levels climb to 5.53 months, which falls into buyer's market territory. And again, that's for Ottawa on the whole. So 2 things about that. First, right? Same reminder as earlier that at this time of year, these ratio stats can get a bit wonky, right? So you have to take them with an even larger grain of salt than usual. But second, in spite of what I just said, Ottawa is now sitting on its highest level of condo inventory in over 8.5 years, right? The last time condo inventory in Ottawa was this high was in February of 2017. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, but there are good deals to be had in the condo market right now for strategic buyers, all right? Especially in the downtown apartment condo market. Moving on, that inventory stat won't come as good news if you're trying to sell a condo right now. However, November's sales to new listings ratio and average time to sell for condos were a little less bleak, right? So the sales to new listings ratio came in at about 49%, which falls right around the midpoint of the range we'd expect to see in a balanced market. And then the average time to sell came in at 43 days, which is also firmly within the range that is typical of a balanced market. So we've got 2 out of 3 indicator stats in balanced market territory and the other in seller's market. And what do we make of it? Same thing we've been making of it for a while. Our condo market is very fragmented right now. There are segments of the market that are performing just fine, right? So think of your townhouse condos, your stacked condos, low-rise buildings, things like that. And then the downtown apartment market, on the other hand, is struggling. All right, that segment is in a strong buyer's market at the moment. And if I'm being honest, I unfortunately don't expect we'll see any sort of significant bounce back in that segment in the near future. On that somber note, we are done with the stats for this month, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before we wrap, allow me to regale you with a couple of quick news updates on stories we've covered here in recent months. And I'm doing this because I want to keep you informed, and I was too lazy to come up with a new topic in this month's market update. First off is an update on the IPRO scandal, right? Which we first told you about in September's update. And really at this point, you could probably call it the IPRO RECO scandal, right? I won't rehash the whole thing here. You can always check out the September update if you want more information on how this all started. But in a nutshell, IPRO was a large brokerage in the GTA that was found to have almost $11 million missing from its trust account. That shortfall was stumbled upon by Ontario's real estate regulator or watchdog, RECO, which is an acronym that stands for the Real Estate Council of Ontario. And upon discovering that the owners of IPRO had essentially stolen millions of dollars from their brokerage trust account, RECO's registrar essentially gave them like a tiny little slap on the wrist and let them off the hook. So when this story broke, of course, there was a lot of talk about the missing millions from IPRO's trust account, but over time, it really kind of morphed into more of a story about RECO's overall ineffectiveness and possible corruption. So when we last left you in September, RECO's registrar, Joseph Richter, had been relieved of his post, and the government of Ontario, which RECO reports to, had hired a firm called Dentons to conduct a full-scale independent audit of RECO. What's happened since then? Well, a lot, and a lot of it came out this week. And look, I'm gonna keep it relatively brief here, okay? But Dentons completed their report and essentially came to the conclusion that you would expect given what we've already told you, right? In their report, Dentons found that RECO had failed to uphold its own standards. Dentons highlighted a number of significant issues with regard to the practices, processes, and procedures at RECO. It pointed to the fact that the procedures that were in place were not being followed by the leadership at RECO, and it ultimately painted RECO as this sort of rudderless organization that lacked adequate governance, transparency, and timely response mechanisms, right? Which are kind of like literally the whole reason why RECO exists in the first place. So in other words, not good. In fact, I would characterize it as a complete mess. Again, my words, not Dentons, but it was kind of between the lines, if you read between the lines. Now, after the Dentons report was published, Stephen Crawford, who is Ontario's Minister of Public and Business Service Delivery, which oversees RECO, moved quite swiftly. On November 28th, Minister Crawford invoked a seldom used emergency power to appoint Jean Lépine as an administrator to take control of RECO effective December 1st. Now, Mr. Lépine has a pretty impressive resume as a communications executive of over 20 years, and his first official act of business on his first day as RECO's new administrator was to fire the entire RECO board of directors and vow to fix what he called a total mess that RECO had made of things. So, all right, well played, Monsieur Lépine. I think you've done more for Ontario real estate in 24 hours than RECO has in the past 10 years. All snark aside, governing bodies are a lot like old homes in the sense that for any gut renovation, the demolition is always the easiest part. Now comes the hard part of having to rebuild Ontario's real estate watchdog in a way that will actually serve the interests of the public and the real estate industry. And I can tell you that from what I'm seeing so far, the overall sentiment across the real estate industry in Ontario is one of guarded optimism. I would think most would agree that Mr. Lépine is at the very least off to a good start, and there's certainly hope that this will all lead to meaningful, positive changes to the way this industry is regulated and policed. But on the flip side, I tell you that there's also a healthy amount of skepticism out there that this will ultimately just lead to some sort of repackaging of the same old RECO, right? In my experience in this industry, the biggest issue with RECO has been that they tend to over-regulate and under-police. So rather than working to eliminate bad actors from the industry, RECO has typically opted to just impose blanket restrictions on everyone, which of course does nothing to deter those bad actors and ultimately hurts good agents and consumers. And I think most of my colleagues would agree with that statement. That's your IPRO and RECO scandal update. As always, we'll keep you posted on any new developments in future updates. I think there's still probably a lot more to come from this story. Now, before we wrap, we've got one more quick update for you, and it has to do with last month's topic, which Andrea did a fantastic job of covering. Of course, we are talking about Bill 60. Quick recap for anyone who hasn't memorized last month's update. And if you haven't, what are you even doing? Everybody should be watching the monthly update at minimum once a day, in my humble opinion. Ollie, how many times have you watched last month's update?
6 times. Just today.
Okay. Whew. Okay, I was gonna say there's more than 6 days in the month, but 6 times today is good. That's why we have to pay Ollie so much, because he's really busy watching updates. Yeah, anyway. So quick recap for the slackers here. Not Ollie. Ollie's not a slacker, but for the slackers, in last month's update, we told you about Bill 60, which was a provincial bill that proposed to make a number of amendments, there we go, to existing acts in Ontario, including some pretty significant changes to our Residential Tenancies Act, aka the Landlord-Tenant Act. Okay? Since that update, Bill 60 has passed, albeit with some modification. And so we can now tell you for sure how Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act will change and how that might impact landlords and tenants. All right, so we're gonna go rapid fire here. These are the 10 changes introduced by Bill 60 as it relates to Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act. First, landlords can now file to evict a tenant for unpaid rent after 7 days. Under the old rule, it was 14 days. Right? So a landlord notifies the tenant that their rent is past due, and if that tenant has not gotten caught up after 7 days of receiving that notification, the landlord can begin the eviction process. All right? Now, it's worth noting that you still need an order from the landlord-tenant board before you can actually evict the tenant. Right? So this change really just shortens the time a landlord has to wait before they can file for a hearing at the board. Okay? Change number 2, landlords will be required to use standard forms for all notices they send their tenants and vice versa. In the past, there was some flexibility. Landlords could use DIY forms, emails, text messages, etc. to notify tenants, which often led to confusion, right? So moving forward, if you fail to use the right form, you risk having any case you bring to the board automatically dismissed. Change number 3, under the old rules, a landlord who wanted to take back their property for personal use had to provide the tenant with 2 months' notice and 1 month's rent as compensation, or 2 months' notice and they had to offer the tenant another suitable unit. Under the new rules, landlords will still have those options, but now they'll also have a third option of providing the tenant with 4 months' notice without any compensation. All right, moving along. Change number 4, and this is a good one. The province will set a clear definition for what constitutes persistent late payment of rent. Okay? You see, the old rules allowed a landlord to evict a tenant who was persistently late on their rent, but it was up to the landlord-tenant board to decide on a case-by-case basis what that meant, right? Or what persistently late looked like. Now we're going to be drawing a clear line in the sand on the issue. The province has yet to say what the threshold will be for being considered persistently late, but of course, once they establish that, we will let you know. Moving on, change number 5, and this one impacts a tenant's ability to raise new issues at their eviction hearing. In the past, a tenant who wasn't paying their rent could show up to their eviction hearing and on that day raise a bunch of new safety or repair related issues. This practice obviously caused a lot of delays in the eviction process, and it increased the backlog at the landlord-tenant board. Starting now, a non-paying tenant who wishes to raise safety or repair issues at their eviction hearing will have to file those issues in advance, so you can't just bring them up on the day of hearing, and they will have to prepay at least half of their unpaid rent in order to do so. All right, halfway through, changes number 6, 7, 8 all kind of go together. All right, so we're going to group them here. First, the window to appeal a landlord-tenant board ruling will shrink from 30 days to 15 days. Okay? Second, we're going to impose greater restrictions on a person's ability to request that an LTB ruling against them be canceled on account that they failed to attend their own hearing. And third, we're also going to impose greater restrictions on the landlord-tenant board's discretionary powers when it comes to delaying or canceling evictions to non-paying tenants for compassionate reasons. Okay? 2 more to go. Change number 9 is that all of these new rules will also apply to housing co-ops. In the past, those operated under a slightly different set of rules. And last but not least, change number 10 gives the provincial government the power to make any regulations needed in order to implement or adjust these new rules. Whew. That's a lot, right? Gotta catch my breath here. As you can imagine, some of these changes have been met with a lot of pushback from a number of tenants and tenant advocacy groups. I think in one of his addresses, Premier Ford literally told one of the protesters to get a job or something like that, go get a job. So there's definitely some tension there. Landlords, on the other hand, are welcoming these changes as a step in the right direction, right? But I would tell you most of them still feel like there remains to be a lot of work to do in order to fix Ontario's broken landlord-tenant board, right? And I gotta tell you, at the risk of upsetting some of you, I tend to agree. I would never tell you to go get a job, but I do kind of agree with these changes. I mean, look, even with these changes, our landlord-tenant rules in Ontario still heavily favor the tenant side. Okay, let's not kid ourselves. And I also firmly believe that the changes introduced by Bill 60 were really more about closing a bunch of well-known loopholes that were being exploited in the old rules. By no means does the balance of power now shift in the landlord's favor, right? This just really kind of inches things a little closer to center, or again, prevents certain bad actors from taking advantage of the rules that were in place or applying the rules in a way that was not in the spirit of the rules, right? And so, yeah, I think it's good. I think it, again, shifts the balance of power a little bit closer to the center. And hey, if you'd like to shift the balance of power on your next move, then you gotta hire the Papineau Group, right? I'm always happy to chat. You can reach me anytime using the information below, or you can use the Calendly link in this video's description to access my calendar and set up a discovery call at a time that works for you. I'm Serge Papineau. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and I'll see you in 2026.